Margaret Collins had always been a woman of quiet habits and long silences. At 78, she lived alone in a pale blue house with white shutters, tucked away on a quiet street in Portland, Oregon. Her husband, Harold, had passed away 8 years earlier, and though her children called occasionally and visited during the holidays, her days had long since blended into one another. She woke early, made herself a single cup of tea, and sat on the creaky wooden porch that faced her modest front yard. There, wrapped in her knit shawl, she would watch the world in its quiet turning. The rustle of trees, the distant hum of school buses, the occasional jogger. But mostly there was stillness. That stillness shifted the morning she noticed the dog. He was thin, ribs just visible beneath patchy fur, and moved with a caution born of hardship. His coat, once likely golden, was caked with dirt and leaves, and he limped slightly as he crept past her gate. At first, Margaret assumed he would move on, like most strays did, but he didn't. He paused at the edge of her garden, sniffed the air, and then disappeared behind the hedge. The next morning, he came again. This time, she noticed the way he glanced toward the porch, eyes wide and alert, but not unkind. There was something in his gaze that held her attention, something tired, something watchful. By the third morning, she set out a shallow dish of scrambled eggs left over from her breakfast. She placed it near the hedge, then returned to her chair, pretending to be uninterested. The dog waited until she had settled before creeping forward, quick and quiet. He didn't eat like a stray, desperate for food. He ate like someone who hadn't had a meal in a long time, but still remembered what it meant to savor something warm. After he finished, he looked up at her, not long, not lingering, then turned and slipped away. That small routine became their silent ritual. Each morning, Margaret prepared a bit of something. Cooked chicken, leftover toast with peanut butter, once even a slice of ham from the back of the fridge. She never tried to touch him, never even stood up while he was nearby. Trust, she understood, was something earned in quiet moments, not forced through kindness. And he came back, always in the early morning, never barking or begging, simply appearing like a shadow with eyes full of stories. Margaret started to look forward to those moments. She would wake with the same ache in her knees, the same stiffness in her hands, but now her heart beat a little faster as she reached for a robe and prepared the morning offering. The porch no longer felt quite so empty. She began talking to him, softly, without expectation. Not commands or questions, just idle thoughts. "Well, you've got a bit more weight on you today," she'd remark with a smile. "That chicken soup must have done something good." Or, "You know, Harold never liked dogs in the house, but I think you'd have won him over. He never answered, of course, and he never let her near, but he listened, or at least she liked to believe he did." One rainy morning, she waited on the porch longer than usual, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, a plate of warm eggs at her side. But the dog didn't come. At first, she told herself it was the weather. No creature in its right mind would choose to be out in the downpour unless it had to. She tried to stay occupied that day, folded laundry, dusted the shelves, reorganized her spice rack, but her eyes kept drifting toward the window, watching the rain roll down in steady sheets. The next morning, the sky had cleared, but the dog was still absent. By the third day, a strange kind of ache had settled in her chest. Not sharp, not even properly painful, but heavy, like something missing from a shelf she hadn't realized was important until it was gone. The porch felt quieter than usual, the silence now intrusive rather than peaceful. She kept the food on the plate anyway, just in case. Memories of Harold came to her more often during those days, not just the usual ones, like his crooked smile or the way he used to hum under his breath while reading, but the harder ones, too. His final weeks in hospice, when he had spoken less and less, until the only way they communicated was through looks. Margaret had learned then the deep language of presence. And now, in the absence of creature that had never even touched her hand, she felt a version of that same silence creeping in. It surprised her how much she missed the dog. She had not named him, not out loud, but in her thoughts, he had become the visitor, a presence as consistent as the sun rising, whose absence made her world suddenly tilt. That evening, As the wind picked up and the sky turned the color of bruised peaches, Margaret sat on her porch with a plate of food untouched beside her. She stared at the hedge, half hoping, half resigned, but no shadow came. That night, she left the porch light on longer than usual, and for the first time in months, she felt truly alone. On the fourth morning, just as Margaret had begun to accept that the dog might never return, he appeared again, emerging slowly from the shadows beyond the hedge like a ghost unsure of its place in the living world. His movements were more sluggish than before, and his fur was still damp in patches, suggesting he had not found proper shelter during the storm. But he was there. That alone made Margaret rise slightly from her chair, breath caught in her throat. She didn't call out, didn't rush toward him. She simply watched as he padded toward the plate she had set down earlier, his head lowered, his ribs still visible, but his demeanor oddly purposeful. Something about him was different, and as he approached the food, she saw it. Tied around his neck, just above the matted fur, was a thin piece of twine, and attached to it, hanging like a forgotten tag, was a small, folded note. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she rose. The dog froze at her movement, but did not retreat. That in itself was new. Carefully, slowly, she stepped forward, her feet steady on the porch's wooden floorboards. He did not bolt. Instead, he stared at her, wary but unmoving, as if he understood something important was about to happen. When she reached the edge of the porch, she crouched, something she hadn't done in years, and extended a hand. The note fluttered slightly in the breeze. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she waited, eyes locked with his, her fingers open and still. He hesitated, then, with a small twitch of his body, took one step forward. That was enough. She gently grasped the edge of the note, her fingers brushing the fur around his neck. It was damp and tangled, but the dog didn't pull away. With great care, she untied the string and took the note into her hands. As soon as it was removed, the dog turned and walked back a few paces, resuming his usual distance. He lowered himself to the ground, front paws stretched forward, watching her with unblinking eyes. Margaret sat back on the porch steps and unfolded the paper. It was creased and a bit smudged, but the words were clear, written in neat, slanted handwriting. "Thank you for feeding our dog. You saved more than you know." There was no name, no return address, just those two short sentences that hit her with the weight of a thunderclap. Margaret stared at the note, reading it again and again. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. The message was simple, but it opened 1,000 questions. Who had written it? Where had the dog come from? Who were we? And what did they mean by save more than you know? The dog, her visitor, was no longer just a stray. He belonged to someone. He had a home, a life beyond the hedges and the early morning rituals. That thought brought with it a sudden and complicated surge of emotion. Relief, yes, that he had people who cared for him, but also something sharper, a quiet pang of loss. She had come to think of him as hers, in a way she hadn't even admitted to herself. The dog finished the food and stood. He didn't leave right away. He lingered at the edge of the yard, glancing back at her with that same thoughtful gaze he always wore. Then, without a sound, he turned and trotted away down the street, disappearing just as he had so many times before. But now Margaret sat with a note in her lap, and a restless energy bubbling under her skin. She spent the rest of the morning walking slowly around her kitchen, the note folded in her apron pocket like a secret. She touched it absently as she stirred her tea, as she washed a few dishes, as she rearranged the jars of jam in the pantry for the third time. Her thoughts looped over the same questions, unable to rest. In the afternoon, she wrote her own note. Not a reply exactly. How could she reply when she didn't know where it had come from? But it was something. She scribbled carefully on a piece of lined stationery. "He is a good dog. I'm glad he has a family. Thank you for the message." She folded it and placed it inside a small plastic sandwich bag, sealing it to protect it from the rain. Then she waited. The dog didn't return the next day, or the one after that. By the third day, the ache in Margaret's chest returned. This time, though, it was tangled with frustration, curiosity, and a growing determination she hadn't felt in years. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the neighbor's rooftop, casting golden streaks across the street, She heard a soft shuffle outside. She hurried to the porch and found him there, sitting patiently near the steps, looking up at her with that same unreadable gaze. Her heart leapt. The note was gone from his neck, but he allowed her to come close enough to attach her own. This time, he even leaned slightly into her hand as she tied the bag gently onto the twine. She didn't expect anything to come of it. She didn't know what she expected, but it felt right, like a conversation in a language neither of them spoke fluently, but both understood deeply. The dog left again, and this time she watched him go down the sidewalk, following his path with narrowed eyes. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He moved with purpose, his head low, his steps sure. Margaret felt something shift inside her. She had lived in the same neighborhood for nearly 4 decades, but realized, in that moment, how little she truly knew beyond the 3 blocks she walked to the pharmacy and back. She had built a life in the boundaries of her routine, and it had grown smaller over time, like a house with rooms slowly locked away. Now, with 1 dog and 1 note, those boundaries were being pushed open. As the porch grew darker and the cool air settled in, Margaret sat in her chair and held the memory of the dog's eyes in her mind. Not just a stray, not just a habit. He was a thread, a connection, and now she was caught in it. The morning after the dog had returned with no note around his neck, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a piece of toast growing cold beside her. The same quiet filled the house, but something inside her had changed. The hunger she felt wasn't for food, it was for answers. The note had unlocked a new curiosity in her, and the way the dog had moved down the street with such certainty left her with the distinct impression that he belonged to a world just beyond the one she had allowed herself to know. That morning, for the first time in years, she laced up her walking shoes, put on her light coat, and placed a small notebook in her purse. When the dog appeared at his usual time and finished his breakfast without a sound, she waited, and when he left, she followed. Margaret didn't attempt to be stealthy. She moved at her natural pace, slightly hunched but steady, keeping her eyes on the path he took and noting every turn in her mind. He didn't look back, but he never picked up speed. If he noticed her, he gave no sign, and she allowed herself to believe that maybe he didn't mind her presence. He led her past the boundaries of her known world, beyond the familiar mailbox on the corner, beyond the grocery store where she used to shop with Harold, beyond even the faded bench where she had once waited for the bus when her knees still permitted longer outings. The farther they went, the more unfamiliar the neighborhood became. The sidewalks were more cracked here, the houses older, many with sagging porches and paint that peeled under the weight of too many seasons. It wasn't the kind of place that invited walking tours or the attention of real estate agents, but there was something quietly alive about it. Children's bicycles leaned against chain-link fences. Laundry lines swayed in backyards. An old man swept his stoop with the slow rhythm of someone who did it not for cleanliness, but for ritual. These were lives she had never noticed before. Parallel stories unfolding just a few blocks from her own. The dog, unaware of the thoughts shifting in her mind, turned down a narrow side street. Margaret followed more cautiously now, her legs beginning to protest the distance. Still, she pressed on. The houses grew smaller here, clustered closer together. At the end of the block, the dog paused in front of a modest, yellow house with a crooked mailbox and a yard half covered in wild grass. He didn't bark. He didn't wait. He simply pushed through a gap in the gate and disappeared toward the back. Margaret stopped at the sidewalk, unsure if she should continue. She clutched her purse a little tighter, glancing around the street. There were no other pedestrians, no cars passing, just the quiet hum of a neighborhood living its own life. Then she saw her, a figure at the window, framed by faded curtains, looking directly at her. A woman, probably in her late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair pulled back and a tired expression softened by surprise. Their eyes met for a long moment. Margaret, frozen on the sidewalk, and the woman behind the glass, holding a dish rag in one hand as if she had been interrupted mid-chore. The woman's gaze dropped briefly, and when it returned, it was filled with something Margaret hadn't expected. Tears. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet overflow of someone who recognized a moment that mattered. Before Margaret could decide what to do, the front door opened. The woman stepped out, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle but edged with disbelief. "You're the one, aren't you?" she said. "The one feeding Buddy." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice low but steady. "I suppose I am." The woman smiled, though her eyes remained wet. "I thought maybe after I sent the note, that was the end of it." Margaret shook her head. "He came back. He always came back." They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by a dog, in a shared act of kindness. Then the woman stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to come in? I can make tea. Or coffee. Whatever you'd like." Margaret hesitated only a second before following her up the steps. Inside, the house was small but clean, filled with signs of a busy life. Toys were tucked into corners. A stack of bills rested on a side table. The scent of something warm and slightly sweet lingered in the air, perhaps cinnamon or baked apples. The woman led her to a worn couch and disappeared into the kitchen. A moment later, she returned with 2 mugs of tea and set them down carefully. "I'm Lila," she said, sitting across from Margaret, "and I guess I owe you more than just a thank you." Margaret took a sip of tea, then looked over the rim of her cup. "What did you mean in the note?" she asked quietly. "You said I save more than I know." Lila nodded slowly, setting her mug down with both hands. "Buddy belonged to my father," she began. "He's 83 now. He was a Marine years ago, but these days he doesn't always remember where he is. Some days he's here with us, and some days he's not." Margaret listened, saying nothing. "Buddy's been with him for almost 10 years, Lila continued. "He's the one constant. The one face my dad always recognizes. When Buddy went missing, it devastated him. For days he wouldn't eat. He kept asking where his dog was. We searched everywhere. But with work and the kids and taking care of Dad, I didn't have much left in me. I thought we'd lost him, and then he came back." Her voice broke slightly, and she blinked quickly. "He looked better, healthier. We knew someone had taken care of him. That's when I decided to send the note. I don't know. Whoever was, I just needed him to know how much it meant." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad he found his way back," she said softly. "He never let me get too close. But I looked forward to seeing him." Lila smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "You were a light to him, and to us." The conversation continued gently, filled with small pieces of their lives. Margaret spoke of Harold, of her quiet routines, of how the dog had filled a space she hadn't realized was so empty. Lila shared stories of her children, of her father's good days and bad ones, of how hard it had been to balance everything. When Margaret finally stood to leave, the sun was already dipping toward the west, and Buddy was lying peacefully by the kitchen door, his eyes half closed. He didn't stir as she passed, but she paused to look at him. "He's a good dog," she said softly. Lila nodded. "He always knows where to go." Margaret stepped out into the cool air, her feet carrying her back along the unfamiliar roads. But this time, the streets didn't feel quite so strange. She had crossed a line in her world, and what she found on the other side had changed her. There were still questions, still pieces of life she didn't understand, but there was also connection, and that made all the difference. Margaret returned home that evening carrying more than just a memory of conversation. She carried a weight she hadn't felt in years, but one that wasn't burdensome. It was a kind of weight that reminded her she was part of something larger than her own quiet routines. She moved through the house with a subtle energy that surprised even her. The silence no longer present as it used to. Instead, it felt like a pause between moments, not the absence of them. The next morning, she woke before the sun, restless. Her legs ached from the long walk the day before, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she had moved. It meant she had stepped outside of the pattern that had confined her for so long. She went to the kitchen, brewed tea, and stared out the window, half expecting Buddy to appear. But he didn't come that day, nor the next. It didn't trouble her as it once might have. Now, she knew where he had gone. And more importantly, she knew he was safe. On the third day, a soft knock at the door startled her. Margaret wasn't used to visitors. especially not in the early hours of the morning. She tightened her robe and opened the door to find Lila standing on the porch with a tired smile and Buddy at her side. He looked up at Margaret with something close to familiarity now, his body language less guarded, more open. "I hope it's not too early," Lila said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I thought maybe we could talk. My dad's having a good morning, and I think he'd like to meet you if you're up for it." Margaret blinked, caught off guard, then nodded. "Give me a moment to get dressed," she said, her voice warm with something between surprise and anticipation. They walked together down the street, slower this time, more deliberate, and it felt less like a journey and more like a ritual already forming. Buddy trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure they were still following. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the sidewalk and turning the edges of the houses gold. Inside Lila's home, Margaret was struck again by how full it felt. Not with things, but with life. There were small signs of care in every corner. A drawing from one of the children taped to the refrigerator, a pair of sneakers by the door, a folded blanket on the back of the couch. She followed Lila down a short hallway and into a room that smelled faintly of aftershave and something older, something like worn pages and polished wood. Sitting in an armchair near the window was an older man, tall even in his seated position, with sharp eyes softened by time. He looked up as they entered, and a slow smile spread across his face. "So," he said, his voice gravelly but strong, "you're the one who's been feeding my dog." Margaret smiled and nodded. "I am. He found me first, though. I just made sure he had something in his belly." The man chuckled. He always was good at finding the right people. Lila stepped forward. "Dad, this is Margaret Collins. Margaret, this is my father, Walter." Walter extended a hand, and Margaret shook it gently. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Buddy came home better than he left," he said. "Cleaner, stronger, happier, even. I don't know what you did, but I know it meant something." Margaret sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "He just needed a little care. I think we both did." Walter studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, thank you." From one old soul to another, their conversation flowed easily after that. Walter spoke of his time in the service, but only in pieces, mostly memories that surfaced like driftwood in a tide, a comrade's laugh, the sound of a distant bugle, the sting of cold mornings overseas. He didn't speak in grand narratives or war stories. Instead, he focused on the simple details, and Margaret listened without interruption, her own mind drifting occasionally to memories of Harold. She didn't share them aloud, but they colored her presence in the room. At one point, Lila brought in coffee and a plate of toast. The smell made Margaret's stomach growl, and she laughed softly as she reached for a piece. "I guess I forgot breakfast," she admitted. Walter raised an eyebrow. "That makes two of us. Want to split another slice?" The ease of the exchange surprised her. It had been a long time since she'd felt welcome in someone else's morning. As the hours passed, the room settled into a rhythm. The children woke and padded into the kitchen, their sleepy greetings warm and curious. One of them, a boy no older than 7, clung to Lila's side before venturing close to Margaret. "You're the lady who gave Buddy food," he said, half statement, half question. Margaret smiled. "Yes, and he was very polite about it." The boy grinned. "He always is, except when he sees squirrels." Laughter rippled through the room, light and effortless. It amazed Margaret how quickly she felt at home in this house that had once been just another stop on a dog's unknown journey. Later, as she prepared to leave, Lila walked to the door. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the porch steps. "I'm really glad you came," Lila said. "You've been a gift to us, Margaret. More than you know." Margaret hesitated, then placed a hand lightly on Lila's arm. "I think maybe we've both been what the other needed." They stood in silence for a moment, neither needing to say more. Buddy lay at the foot of the steps, his head on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. Margaret looked down at him, then out at the street, her gaze tracing the path back home. But it didn't feel so far anymore. The neighborhood had changed, not in its appearance, but in its presence. It was no longer a vague collection of houses and names she didn't know. It was a place filled with lives that touched hers in ways she had never expected. When she returned to her own house, she sat on the porch and opened her notebook. It had been blank for years. She turned the first page and began to write, not a diary, not a story, but pieces. Pieces of what had happened, of what she had learned, of what might come next. Because something had shifted in her. The silence she once filled with routine had been replaced by something richer. There was still quiet, yes, but it was filled with meaning now, with memory, with promise. And in that silence, she waited, not for a dog this time, but for whatever came next. The next few weeks passed in a quiet, but noticeable transformation. Margaret's life, once governed by a repetitive stillness, now pulsed with soft but steady change. It began with the simple act of walking. No longer content to sit idly on the porch, she took daily strolls through the neighborhood, allowing herself to wander just far enough to pass Lila's street, sometimes pausing at the corner in case Buddy was lounging in the front yard or one of the children waved from the porch. She didn't always stop in, but the knowledge that she could, that she was welcome, was enough to lend her steps a new kind of certainty. Buddy, true to his nature, resumed his visits to Margaret's yard. He didn't come every day, but often enough that his absence never grew heavy again. His presence no longer meant a silent exchange of food and distance. Now, he trotted up the path, tail wagging gently, and sometimes rested his head on her knee as she sat on the porch. She had taken to keeping a small towel near the door just for him, wiping his fur clean when it rained. In time, he allowed her to brush him. It became another ritual, quiet, unrushed, and strangely intimate, like the rekindling of an old friendship. But Margaret had started thinking beyond her own home. One afternoon, she sat with Lila at the kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea as the late sun poured through the windows. The children played in the yard, their laughter a distant melody. Walter dozed in his chair in the next room, a half-finished crossword on his lap. Margaret turned to Lila, her voice hesitant but firm. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how many people live in this neighborhood the way I used to. Alone, not just in their houses, but in themselves." Lila looked up, curious. "Go on." "Well," Margaret continued, setting her mug down, "it's not just us, is it? I've passed by dozens of homes, some with gardens gone to weeds, some with porches that haven't seen visitors in years. And I wonder, what if there's something we can do? Something small but real." Lila tilted her head. "Like what?" "A kind of club, maybe," Margaret said, warming to the idea as she spoke. "Not anything formal. Just neighbors, seniors, families, anyone really, coming together, sharing meals, offering help, talking. I've spent too long thinking I was the only one feeling like this. But I know now that's not true." Lila's smile grew slowly, the way it always did when something clicked into place. "You know, that's actually a beautiful idea. And I think a lot of people will respond to it more than you'd imagine. We just need to start small. One gathering, maybe a weekend afternoon. We can spread the word." And so they did. The first gathering was held in Lila's backyard. They strung up a few paper lanterns, set out folding chairs, and covered 2 long tables with mismatched tablecloths. Margaret brought her best carrot cake, Harold's favorite recipe, and Lila cooked a pot of her mother's lentil stew. The children helped by making signs with color markers. Neighborhood gathering, all welcome. They taped them to mailboxes, pinned them to community boards, and handed them out at the local pharmacy. To Margaret's amazement, people came. Some were neighbors she had passed 100 times without a word exchanged. Others were younger families, juggling toddlers and tired smiles. There was Mr. Harlan from the corner house, who brought a tray of deviled eggs, and Mrs. Alvarez from 2 blocks over, who hadn't been out much since her husband died last year. Walter sat proudly by the fire pit, offering stories and jokes in equal measure, and Margaret noticed how people leaned in to listen, how they smiled a way that said they missed hearing someone like him. The air was filled with the sound of voices overlapping. Introductions, memories, laughter. Strangers became acquaintances. Acquaintances began to look like friends. Margaret moved among them with a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't hosting, not exactly, but she was the reason it had begun, and everyone seemed to sense that. Buddy wandered to the gathering like an honored guest, accepting scraps and affection with equal grace. At one point, a little girl curled beside him a book, and he rested his head on her lap. It was a perfect image of peace, and Margaret caught herself watching them with damp eyes. That night, as the last of the lanterns were taken down and the dishes were washed, Margaret stood on the porch beside Lila, watching the moon rise over the rooftops. This could be something regular. Lila said, once a month, maybe, or even more often. Margaret nodded. I think people need it. We all do. It didn't end with just one meeting. The neighborhood gatherings became a fixture. Sometimes they took the form of shared dinners. Other times, they helped someone clean up their yard or cook meals for a family going through a rough patch. A young man volunteered to start a monthly newsletter. A retired schoolteacher began organizing storytelling nights. The community, once disconnected and distant, began to breathe together. Margaret, who had once measured her days by the stillness of her porch, now found them marked by connection. She was no longer invisible. She had become, in many ways, the thread stitching others together. Not because she sought the role, but because she had followed one small act of care and allowed it to bloom into something larger. Buddy remained a constant, his role unchanged but deeply symbolic. He continued to visit Margaret, not out of need, but out of habit, and perhaps love. He would arrive in the mornings, tail wagging softly, and sometimes stay for hours. Margaret found herself talking to him even more, not because she was lonely, but because she enjoyed it. He had become a presence, a kind of bridge between worlds. Hers and Lila's, solitude and community, past and present. On one particular morning, as Buddy lay curled at her feet and the neighborhood slowly stirred to life around her, Margaret opened her notebook again. The pages were filling with observations, names, ideas. But she paused, pen hovering over the paper, and instead looked out at the street. The porch was no longer a threshold between her and the world. It had become a meeting place, a symbol of welcome. People passed by and waved. Some stopped for a quick chat. Children occasionally dropped off drawings or asked if Buddy could come out and play. Margaret smiled to herself, her heart full not just of memory, but of movement. What had started as a quiet exchange between a lonely woman and a lost dog had grown into a revival of sorts, not grand, not loud, but steady and real. And every morning, when Buddy trotted up the path and rested his chin on her knee, she welcomed him not as a visitor, but as a companion, as the one who, without meaning to, had changed everything.